welcome to yet another webinar from Reach Law, this time on Turkey, KKDIK Lead Registration Process, and the first part of three distinct webinars on this lead registration process in Turkey. And today we are going to talk about the lead registrant nomination part, so the first part thereof. So welcome everyone, and today we have two presenters, Sibel Kilic and myself. Sibel, do you want to go first and introduce yourself?
Hello. Just you may hear some voice from my side, specific to Turkey, I believe. And then my name is Sibel Kilic. I'm working as a director at Reach Law Turkey, living in Istanbul, and I'm responsible for the team here in Turkey. As a background, I'm a chemist and hold PhD in organic chemistry. In my career, I have been working on Reach since 2013, and then with KKDIK since 2017, when the KKDIK regulation implemented in Turkey. And thank you. Hope you enjoyed the webinar. We will keep discussing in Q&A part at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Very good, thank you, Sibel. And there was some noise at in the background, and that's fine. So I'm Fredrik Johansson. I'm a partner, head of sales here at Reach Law, and I'm joining today not from Turkey but from Manchester. So that's the why the different backdrop for those of you who notice. I've been at Reach Law for 15 years already, but I have a long career back before even that on EHS and chemical regulatory topics, chemical engineer by background, and of course today very happy to be here and discuss the KKDIK lead registration topics with you attending this webinar. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Sibel. And Sibel will, as she mentioned, join for the Q&A part. So have your questions ready besides the ones that have been pre-submitted. Anyway, as mentioned in the beginning, this will be part one of a three-part series on the Turkey KKDIK lead registration process. So today we're talking about the lead registrant nomination part, and within later on this year, during Q4, we will have part two. So we'll talk about data access, dossier development, and this provisional registration part, which we will not be discussing today because it's not part of this lead registration nomination part. And then, of course, the submission of these dossiers during the part two session. And then part three, later on also this year, still this year, the joint registration management part, which will conclude this three-part series. So stay tuned for those invites. They will be dropping into your inbox as part of a usual Reach Law newsletter later on within some weeks from this webinar. So indeed, a busy schedule again. We'll have a quick overview of Reach Law for those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time. Then we'll look at the KKDIK registration process in general, just to give you a brief recap overview. I will not go into such a lot of details anymore on the backgrounds. You can revisit our other webinars if you want more background information on the KKDIK regulation and the basics there. Then we'll look at these new procedures and principles, the lead registrant part thereof, so Article 8, which covers this lead registration selection part. So this will be a focus here in this webinar. Then, of course, we'll discuss that in much more detail during this initiating the lead registration process part, so part 4 of this webinar. Then we'll have present an action plan at the end before concluding and going to the Q&A part. Duration, as you probably suspect already, at least if you participated in other webinars hosted by yours truly, it will go over 1 hour. So if you have to leave, I understand. You can always catch up on our recording on YouTube later on. So thank you. And for those of you who stayed all the way till the end, much appreciated, of course. So quick run through what Reach Law is, what we do, with specific focus on Turkey, of course. So we focus on chemical regulation and chemical product regulations and REACH-like chemical regulations globally. And we have offices around the world in almost all countries that have, or all countries that have this REACH-like chemical regulation. Maybe if you say that Taiwan is REACH-like, which I do not think it is, or China, which I do not think will be. Those are the countries we do not yet have offices in, which could maybe be construed as having REACH-like regulation. But nonetheless, head office is in Helsinki. Then we have an office in Manchester, UK, for UK REACH purposes, and that's where I'm calling in from today. A small office also in Belgium. Then, of course, in Istanbul in Turkey, where Sibel is calling in from, providing Turkey, KKDIK and SIA related support, so SIA being the CLP implementation in Turkey. Then we also have offices in India, not specifically for chemical regulatory purposes, but for supporting local clients, and then also on this India BIS, which is a product adherence standard. We will not talk about that today. But then also in Seoul in South Korea for K-REACH, K-OSHA purposes, and then our newest newcomer is, of course, Ukraine REACH and CLP and the law of chemical safety, something that we're providing our support for through our office in Kyiv in Ukraine. And of course, for EU REACH, EU CLP, it's the Helsinki head office that is dealing with those regulations. Anyway, we have three, if you will, three legs of our services. One is, of course, product compliance, focused highly on chemical regulatory compliance, and that's one of the topics we're talking today of being, of course, Turkey, KKDIK, and SIA, well, focusing on KKDIK Lead Registration Process. But we provide then also product-related support for, here we have the India BIS, for example, PCN, skip to some level, and ESPR-related topics. We also provide advocacy support for example, for helping clients, customers deal with for example, these public consultations as part of these regulatory files for new regulations, seeking input from the industry. We help companies with that and much more. I will not go into the details here. Also, sustainability-related services such as providing support for SVHCs and circular economy-related topics. But our biggest and strongest leg, I would say, or the most significant leg of our services is, of course, chemical regulatory and product compliance. And that will be the focus of today. So for Turkey, we provide a full set of services, everything from only representation to registration support to lead registration support, which we'll be talking about today, but also consortia, SIEF management, consulting, trading, SDS certification, authorization, authoring, etc. So everything that is needed to comply with KKDIK and the SIA regulation in Turkey. And we do this through our office in Istanbul, where Sibel is calling in from today. So we're one of the leading only representative service providers worldwide for these regulations we've been discussing, including KKDIK. And as mentioned, we have this YouTube channel called REACH Law Talks, which I invite you to have a look at. This webinar will be there within a couple of days, and you will find a lot of other videos there also, dedicated YouTube content, as well as then, of course, these webinars that we are having on multitude of different topics. And as of today, if I counted correctly, we have 152 videos on our channel already. So have a look, and if you like this content, feel free to subscribe and, of course, give a like. That I think helps other people that are interested in these type of subjects to find this content. And it's, of course, everything is free of charge and available there for anyone and everyone to consume at their liking. So indeed, we specialize in chemical regulatory product, regulatory compliance, advocacy, and sustainability. That's what we do. And by the way, if you want to meet us in person on the European continent, besides of course visiting us at our offices, then of course feel free to drop by ChemCon in Venice end of this month. We will be there and we will be presenting also various topics. So if you are there, come say hello and have a discussion, etc. So before now going into the bulk of the presentation, just the usual disclaimer. So the content of this presentation is for general information purposes only, and if you need some specific support or consultancy, then you need to reach out to us. So we are not expecting or accepting any like liability claims or responsibility if something is correct or incorrect in this case. But this have a read at the disclaimer and copyright, and with that said, we will go into the bulk of the presentation today, and I will just kill off the video feed just to have one less annoying face in your face during this webinar, and to save a bit of bandwidth for our colleagues who are connecting around the world. So indeed, let's look at the KKDIK registration process and give a quick overview thereof. I think many of you know this already, but nonetheless, good to have a quick run through. So indeed, the basic requirement is that if you are manufacturing or importing substances within the scope of the KKDIK regulation, and more specifically within the scope of the registration requirement at 1 ton or more, you will have to pre-register these and eventually then register these the same way that we have for EU REACH, for example. So the same requirements apply, no data, no market, meaning that if you don't provide data on your substances, then you will not have market access for your substances in Turkey. The scope is very, very wide, as we know, essentially the same scope as under EU REACH, meaning that all substances which are unless specifically exempt from the KKDIK regulation as a whole or specific parts of the regulation are within the scope. So I would say that most substances are, if you're taking like a snapshot of different chemicals, then 99% of those at least would drop into the scope of the KKDIK regulation, and almost equally high number would fall into the scope of requiring a registration under KKDIK regulation. So very, very broad and wide impacting on the chemical industry and companies placing these chemicals on the Turkish market. So indeed, these substances that need to be registered at 1 ton or more need to be registered in different tonnage bands, 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, and over 1,000 tons. And depending on the tonnage band, you need to provide certain information as part of your registration dossier. Specifically, the lead registrant is providing most of the endpoint data pertaining to FISC, Chemtox, Ecotox information. We'll talk about that in the few next slides. Co-registrants provide specific information pertaining to their manufacture and placing on the market and volumes and stuff like that, but generally do not provide them this type of endpoint information. Anyway, you can register as full substances or as intermediates, on-site isolated intermediates or transported isolated intermediates. If these are strictly controlled conditions, then you can benefit from lesser data requirements and lesser registration fees. And of course, being in Turkey, submissions are in Turkish language and they are submitted through this KKS system. We'll have a quick slide on the KKS system, but you will see that mentioned many times here during this webinar today. So indeed, depending on what type of substance you have and the volumes, annual volumes thereof, you have different registration deadlines. And these were amended back in 2023 already, so they were extended, but these are not being extended anymore. So these are the final deadlines. And indeed, for over 1,000-ton substances or substances that are very toxic to aquatic organisms at 100 tons or more, and then the CMR substances category 1A and 1B at 1 ton or more, will have this first registration deadline coming up end of next year, so 2026. Then for the lesser tonnage bands, 100 to 1,000, it's a couple of years after that, 31st of December 28, and then for the smallest tonnage bands, 1 to 10, 10 to 100, it's end of December 2030. So if you look at this in a sort of a flow chart or this process flow, then indeed today we are coming up on end of this year, end of 25, which shows on the slide here. Let me get my pointer. Shows us as 26 beginning. So indeed, we have 50 months more or less until the first registration deadline, 39 months to the next at the end of 28, and 63 by end of 2030 for the last deadline. So indeed, time is ticking for the first deadline, in particular, coming up already at the end of the next year. But we can't lie on our laurels, because as we will see today, for those who are becoming or want to become lead registrants, this is now is the time to work through the hoops to get yourself elected as a lead registrant by end of this year. We'll talk about that in the coming slides. The inquiry phase, so an inquiry process will be introduced after the last registration deadline. So not after the next deadline or the deadline after that one, but after the last deadline. So that is some new nuggets of information here. So indeed, the joint submission concept applies also in Turkey under KKDIK. So it means that for one substance, all companies intending to register the same substance have to work together to share data, share costs, select the lead registrant who submits the joint registration dossier, so the lead registration dossier as it's called here in this presentation, containing all the FISCEM, TOX, ECOTOX information, CSRs also where applicable, if not submitted by co-registrants specifically or separately. So indeed, today we are talking about this lead registrant role and how the members of the pre-SIEF will be electing this lead registrant. So each substance can have 0 to many co-registrants, but they will always only have one KKDIK lead registrant. In some cases, if you are the only registrant for your substance, then of course you will only be a lead registrant. There will be no other members joining the joint submission as co-registrants, because you are the only one registering the substance. And all of this, the lead registration dossier and co-registration dossiers will then have to be submitted to the ministry for through KKS and by the applicable registration deadlines. So if we look at this workflow going from pre-registration to the actual registration, then indeed we now know, based on this new procedures and processes that was published in August this year, that there will be, and there is, a deadline for submitting your pre-registrations that for substances that have already been on the market in Turkey before this. So if you are now placing substances on the market and you have not yet pre-registered under KKDIK, then now is the time to do it, because you have until end of this month to have them pre-registered, because that is a hard deadline. So once you pre-register, you become a member of the pre-SIEF. In this pre-SIEF, you then have to agree on substance identity with other companies and to form a SIEF. In practice, this is can be done simultaneously as selecting the lead, but in practical terms, you actually go ahead and first select the lead registrant, and you have to do this by end of this year. So this is something we will focus on today here. How to elect, what are the mechanisms thereof, and how to get it done by this deadline for end of this year, applicable to all substances regardless of when they are having their ultimate registration deadline. Then besides selecting your lead, you will also, of course, then have to go forward with preparing the lead registration dossier. So now we know also, based on these procedures and principles, that you also have to prepare this provisional registration as a lead registrant and submit it by end of March next year. There are some cases where this is not needed, and this will be discussed actually in part 2 in much more detail than today. But besides then preparing, submitting the provisional registration, you also need to, of course, prepare your lead registrant dossier and submit it by the applicable registration deadline. And do that in good time, actually, before the applicable registration deadline, so that other companies intending to register the same substance by the applicable registration deadline, for example, the first deadline, will have ample time to do so by buying the letter of access and then compiling their own dossiers and submitting this. So there's quite a lot of steps in getting you all the way to having your substances registered as both a lead registrant and then as a co-registrant. And this will be discussed in great detail, I could say, during this webinar series. As of today, or today actually in this webinar today, we will be discussing this lead registrant, mostly this lead registrant selection and election process. We'll also talk about SIEF communication and the SIP in brief, but highly focused on this selecting the lead registrant, etc. So indeed, for those of you who are wondering what the SIEF was or what was a pre-SIEF, then indeed it stands for Substance Information Exchange Forum, and this is when you have pre-registered your substance, you will become a member of a pre-SIEF in this KKSIT system. So essentially a list of companies who are intending to, excuse me, register the same substance. So once you have agreed on the substance identity, then it becomes magically a SIEF. It's no longer a pre-SIEF, but a SIEF. And as said, a SIEF can, a pre-SIEF can be made up of a single company or multitude of companies. It depends on how many companies have pre-registered a substance and eventually then intending to register the substance by the applicable deadlines. So indeed, if you have not already KKDIK pre-registered substances you're placing on the Turkish market, then the deadline is end of October this year, so 31st of October 2025. So get it done. So what is a lead registrant? So we had a brief look at this, but this explains it in a bit more detail. So a lead registrant is a company that takes upon itself the responsibility in the SIEF, so per substance, one substance, you have one lead registrant to manage and coordinate all the work in this SIEF, to get organized, then to clarify the substance identity, then of course collect data, collect information from the members of this SIEF, the pre-SIEF or SIEF, and assemble this data into dossiers, first starting with this provisional registration, and then later on with this full lead registration dossier that can also incorporate the CSR where needed, or it can be submitted separately by the co-registrants. Depends on what you agree. And of course, share costs fairly transparently and non-discriminatorily between all the members. And as part of that, you also sell letter of accesses, LOAs, so to speak, for the provisional registration and then the full registration later on. In some cases, it be just one letter of access covering both. It depends on how you would define this in the SIEF and how you choose to cooperate. And of course, the lead then submits all of these dossiers through the ministry. So this MOEUCC in the slides, Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change, through the KKS IT system, and of course does this in good time before the applicable deadlines. And then it doesn't stop there. The lead also has to keep the dossiers and the registrations up to date, and of course have these record keeping obligations and have to respond to communications and requests by the authorities, etc. So being a lead is you have responsibilities, but it is not how would you say, unreasonable to be a lead in that sense. Someone always has to become the lead. So what does the lead dossier contain? So it contains several sections are the same as in the co-registration dossier, which reflects company-specific information such as substance identity information, and then of course the company-specific information, classification and labeling information, guidance of safe use could be also submitted by the co-registrants, but here it's perceived as being submitted by the lead. Then the chemical safety report, including exposure scenarios where applicable, robust study summaries on the substance properties, testing proposal where applicable, appendices such as the strictly controlled appendix, etc. And then the chemical safety report is actually included as an appendix also in the dossier, albeit it's here separately mentioned already. All of this is then compiled into a dossier, the lead dossier, submitted to the ministry through KKS. I will not go into the intricacies of the dossier per se in great detail here. Just like to say that indeed we have, like EU REACH, there are a lot of requirements for endpoint data for information defined in these annexes of the KKDIK regulations. So Annex 7 has certain endpoints that apply to all substances. Then Annex 8 add to those requirements. They start from 10 tons or more per year. Then we have Annex 9 for applicable to 100 to 1,000 tons, or from 100 up substances. And then we have, of course, the highest tonnage band, 1,000 tons per year, where you also have this Annex 10 requirements to fulfill. So a lot of information to be included in the lead dossier. I will not go into details here, just wanted to show these annexes here, as well as the chemical safety report also. As said, it can be submitted by the lead or the co-registrants, depending on how you agree. If you have an intermediate under strictly controlled conditions, then the requirements for on-site isolated intermediates is essentially 0. None of these apply. If it's transported isolated intermediate at 1,000 tons or more, then this first Annex 7 applies also. I will not talk about that in any great detail here. Just to show here number of endpoints, indeed, you can see that they incrementally increase the higher the tonnage band. So these are the aggregate number of endpoints, and usually the higher the tonnage, or the higher the tonnage band, the more demanding information is required, and for example, longer study durations to fulfill those endpoints are required. But as we know from EU REACH, when we have this generated already for EU REACH, then on an endpoint level, this information can be used as such for KKDIK purposes. So no new tests, studies typically are needed when lead registering or registering substances under the KKDIK regulation, because we can use existing information from EU, provided that information is the data holders in the EU, for example, are granting access to that against, of course, compensation. So what is a co-registration? And a co-registrant is then responsible for their own registration, not just their own and the whole joint submission, but just their own registration. So indeed, Besides that, they of course have to cooperate in the SIEF. They have to agree on the substance identity. We'll talk about this. If they have data, they need to share, but they will always need to share in their costs. What that means is that they pilot these letter of accesses to the this provisional registration, and later on to the full registration, or it could be combined, as mentioned earlier. This will be covered in more detail in part 2 of this webinar series. Then they need to, of course, prepare the provisional co-registration dossier submitted by the applicable deadline. Again, this will be discussed in more detail during part 2 from a lead registrant perspective, but we will also touch upon what it means from a co-registrant perspective, because they are the ones who need to buy letter of accesses thereof, but not in this webinar today. And of course, they then have to submit the final registration dossier to the ministry by the applicable deadlines, and then keep these dossiers up to date and communicate with authorities where applicable, and keep records of your compliance for potential inspections, etc. And the co-registrant dossier is much more simple. Of course, substance identity information, such as in the lead dossier on behalf of the lead registrant, but then also company-specific information, such as who's manufacturing, who's the company submitting, what are the annual volumes of these tonnage of the substance, etc. Uses guidance on safe use. Sometimes this can be submitted on behalf of the lead, on behalf of all the other ones. Co-registrants, the same goes with the CSR, albeit nowadays we see this being submitted, prepared jointly, but submitted individually by each registrant, including the co-regs, as part of the registration process. Again, appendices, strictly controlled conditions, appendices, etc., and CSR being an appendix, are also submitted by the co-registrant, and then of course creation of the dossier, and then compiling it into a submission file and submitting it through the KKS IT system. So if you look at the registration fees applicable to both co and lead registrants, indeed, the higher the tonnage band, the higher the cost. So going from very modest 80 euros more or less per registration to the higher 1,200 euro or more per registration for the higher tonnage bands. This is a couple of days old, so exchange rates fluctuate, but this is more or less what they are in euros and in Turkish liras, of course. So significantly cheaper than in the EU, where it's 23,000 plus for a full, for a 1,000-ton dossier, full substance. So for a large company, if you are an SME, you can apply for discounts, as we do, for example, under EU REACH. So indeed, the KKS system is through where you actually compile everything, and through which you submit registration dossiers, pre-registrations, inquiries later on, etc. It stands for the Chemical Registration System in Turkish. I will not even try to pronounce this. It's completely online. There is no upload of iUclid files, etc. You do work online on the system completely. So it's in a way, it's a combination of REACH IT, iUclid 6, and the KSR tool. And you need a Turkish citizenship to access it, and if you don't have an account, then it could take up to 2 weeks to activate. So just for your information. But if you're using a REACH law, then of course we can create it quicker, because we do sub-accounts for our clients, and that can be spun up instantly, more or less. So indeed, after the last registration deadline, end of 2030, all substances that are placed on the Turkish market at 1 ton or more that have not been registered must first go through the inquiry procedure. And once they've been accepted for inquiry, then they will have to register. And once the substance has been registered, then and only then can you start placing the substance on the Turkish market at 1 ton or more. So indeed, the inquiry procedure will not be there starting next year for these, starting 2027 for these first deadline substances, but indeed it will be only after the last deadline, at which time it will work like EU REACH, more or less. At the moment, the KKS system is undergoing updates, and it's not still possible to submit registration dossiers. You can do everything else, including these lead registrant nominations, votes, etc., which we'll be looking at in the next section, but you cannot submit registration dossiers. And this is likely the reason for why it's still not possible is because they are integrating these provisional registration templates into the system. So they're updating it, and likely it will be completely able to, you would be completely able to submit registration dossiers within some weeks. Let's see how that pans out. Time-wise can be tricky indeed. So some quick statistics. So indeed, more than 300,000 pre-registrations have been received, almost 3,400 almost lead registrant nominations have been performed. This is a couple of weeks ago, latest statistics that I integrated here into this presentation. Still, because of this moratorium on submissions, it is still this 2,400 lead registrations that have been submitted. That has not changed for now 1.5 years more or less. So the ministry is expecting around 15,000 different substances to be registered under KKDIK, and different substances, that is, under EU we have around 22,000 plus substances. Now that they have been, some of the substances have been consolidated, merged, etc., the numbers become a bit less than 23,000 what it used to be. But in Turkey, they're expecting around 15,000 different substances to be registered, and they're expecting around 50,000 co-registrations. So you can see that if the 15,000 different substances going to be registered, it means that there will be 15,000 lead registrants plus then another 50,000 co-registrants. So quite a lot of registration work still ahead of us, considering the where we are with the numbers today. And then this is estimated to impact more than 10,000 different companies globally who are either, of course, in Turkey themselves, have subsidiaries in Turkey, or then are selling chemicals to Turkey and are appointing owner representatives there. But indeed, now let's look at the lead registrant focus in these procedures and principles. We'll go through this in more detail in the section 4, initiating the lead registration process. So I will go through this quite quickly, these few slides, because this was covered in quite great detail in my previous webinar from around a month ago or so, where we discussed these procedures and principles more widely. But indeed, these were published in August by the ministry for the purpose of clarifying certain procedures pertaining to the KKDIK registration process. It was, of course, in Turkish, but you can download it online in the link shown on the screen here. If you look at the contents of this document, I will not go through all of these different subsections, but just to highlight the selection of the lead registrants part, which is highlighted in yellow. This is Article 8 of this procedures and principles document, and this will be actually the focus here in this part 1 presentation, where we're talking about lead registrant selection. So much of that information actually comes now from this procedures and principle document that was published, as said, in August. And this is now law. So this procedures and principles document, as published, is now law in Turkey. So what it says applies. Very important to understand. It is not a recommendation. It is law. So as a very quick summary, we'll go through all of this in more detail in the upcoming section, but what it does provide in the context of lead registrant selection is under this Article 8, it defines a deadline for lead registrant selection, end of this year. That is why we are in a bit of a hurry. We'll talk about this, how the selection of a lead registrant is performed, what happens if no one wants to become a lead registrant, beyond the obvious, of course, that the substance will not be registered, who would be a good lead registrant candidate, how to take care of certain SIEF related communication pertaining to this lead registrant nomination and SIEF agreements, etc. And what if a lead registrant has already been nominated, but the lead registration dossier has not yet been submitted, what happens in those cases? All of these will be covered here next. So if we look at a new timeline summary indicating these different deadlines that were produced as part of these procedures and principles, or introduced into the legal text as part of these procedures and principles, we can see here that we have the pre-registration deadline. We're coming very close to that today, end of this month. Then we have this lead registrant selection or appointment needs to be done by end of this year. So the selection process has to be completely completed. We'll talk about that. But then we had also these provisional registrations for requirements for leads in certain cases which need to be submitted by end of March. And then for co-registrants, end of September. But this we will not talk about today. This is part 2. So stay tuned for that. So today our focus is on this red box here. What needs to happen by end of this year as for lead registrants that are for companies who are nominating themselves as lead registrants, and what has to happen so that they will be actually selected as a lead registrant by end of this year. So indeed, as time is getting short, we have the last quarter just started, was the last week, then the week before that actually. Yeah. So we have less than 3 months to actually get this done, meaning get the lead registrant selection process completed by end of this year. So time is short. That was the point of that slide. But now, indeed, let's look at this initiating the lead registration process section, which is has these 4 subsections. I'll give you an overview of the whole lead registration process and what we are covering here today, and then this lead registrant selection, which will be, I would say, the pinnacle of this presentation. We'll touch upon SIEF communication that the lead registrant has to do as part of the lead registration process, as well as this defining the SIP, so the substance identity profile. So indeed, if we have a quick overview on the lead registrant process from start to finish, this will be all the topics that we are covering during these 3 distinct parts of this webinar series. So indeed, today we are focusing on these first ones. So the lead registrant selection, SIEF communication, and substance identity profile definition and agreement. Then in the next part, we'll talk about data access negotiations, data collections. We'll talk about what information is reviewed as part of the lead registration work, how to create CSR exposure scenarios where needed based on existing information from EU REACH, existing CSRs. Look at what information could be subject to translation, etc. Then we'll talk about this preparation of the provisional lead registration, submission and selling of partial letter of access, and why we will need a partial letter of access at this point in time. We'll also touch upon provisional co-registration, just to understand the whole process here. And then we'll talk about lead dossier compilation, so preparing the lead registration dossier in KKS and submission, and the letter of access sales for the actual registration that is required. As said, it could be that in some cases we only have one letter of access covering both the provisional registration and the actual registration. But the point here is why likely there will be a split up into two laws is because in some cases we do not know all the costs that will accrue for co-registrants that buy a letter of access for the actual registration at the point of when this is needed for the provisional registration. But we'll touch upon this in much more detail. Then the last part 3 of the webinar series will actually discuss joint registration management part. So it will be the tail end of this presentation. So stay tuned for part 2, which will cover a lot of information, which also this part 1, of course, covers. So indeed, the lead registrant selection part. So if we look at what this procedures and principles document, Article 8 says about this. So indeed, for substances that are already on the Turkish market by the time of publication of this procedures and principles, the lead registrant must be selected by end of this year. So this selected is key here. It just doesn't mean that you are just appointed or voted for in the KKS system, but you also need to have certain parts of the cooperation, like the SIEF Agreement, agreed to between the members. So, but we'll come back to that. However, for substances that are placed on the Turkish market for the first time after this deadline, this timeline for publication, then you have to prepare this, have a lead registrant selected within 6 months of this date of placing the substance on the market. This will likely not be a big case. Most of us will live here in the first bullet, meaning that we have to select the lead by end of this year, and this will be the way we will discuss about this topic in this presentation going forward. Still, lead registrants are selected on a voluntary basis, and it also means that no one will force you to become a lead. Let me make that very clear. This was slightly unclear before this. There was a workshop, I'll come back to that in a few slides, that was held last week, but now it's clear that no one will be forcing a lead registrant role upon anyone. It will continue to be on a voluntary basis, but if there are no lead registrants for a specific substance, then the ministry will discuss with this Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchanges in Turkey, TOB, and other associations that could be stakeholders on who should become a lead registrant for the substance, or who they recommend becoming or suggest becoming a lead, and then there would be a dialogue with this company and hoping they would become actually the lead. As said, if there is no lead, there is no joint submission. If there's no joint submission, there is no registration. So if you are placing a substance on the Turkish market and you want to continue to doing so after the registration deadline, then you need a lead registrant. And actually, not just the registration deadline, but actually by the provisional registration deadline, you will need a lead registrant. So it is quite critical. But no one will be shoving the lead registrant role down your throat involuntarily, if as a matter of as a metaphor. So indeed, how does the nomination process work? So it's a self-nomination process, again according to this Article 8 of this procedures and processes. So what you do is you nominate yourself as a lead registrant in the KKS system. We'll look at what this looks like in screenshots in the next slides. besides then indicating this simple click of a couple of buttons in the KKS system, you also need to separately by email send to all the pre-registrants of that particular substance an email containing justification why you would be a good lead registrant. For example, you have the necessary experience, you've been doing this since for EU Reach, for example, in the past, so you know what it means. You are a data holder, you are representing high tonnage bands for the substance for Turkey, or you have a high vested interest in this substance for various reasons. You are demonstrating trustworthiness. You have a long track record of being a solid, for example, only representative, etc. So there are a lot of things that you can provide as justifications why you would be a good lead registrant. Of course, I would say you do not have to have the highest tonnage band, albeit if you have the highest tonnage band, it usually is an indication that you have a high vested interest in this, in registering the substance and maybe becoming a lead, but it's not necessary. Also, you do not have to be data rich. It is, of course, easier if you are data rich, but it is not mandatory. But I would say the most critical of these is that, do you have the experience to do it? Because at the end of the day, if you don't have the experience, for example, from EU Reach, on dealing with joint submissions, dealing with other companies, for issuing agreements, for doing the cooperation that is needed, and working on this transparently, non-discriminatorily, and fairly, then I would say it's a bit of a red flag. So I would say anyone who has experience, enough experience from EU Reach to do this, then those are generally good candidates for becoming lead registrants. And as said in previous webinars, it can also be an only representative, and in many cases actually for Turkey, only representatives are lead registrants. But in those cases, again, highly recommended to check that the only representative has done and has experiences with lead registration work, and preferably from EU Reach already, because then they have gone through the tough school of knowing what to do and doing it by the book, because the same requirements apply in Turkey also. And Reach Law, for example, has a lot of experience in submitting EU Reach lead dossiers, and also Turkish lead registrations and UK lead dossiers. So that's we have such experience, and other ones also have this experience, of course, but just give you an illustrative example. And of course, being slightly self-serving, but again, this is our webinar. So indeed, in the KKS system, how you nominate yourself. In this first shot, you will see that this is a nomination in KKS without other candidates. So what it means is that here in this green button, you can press to nominate yourself as a lead registrant, where there are no other companies yet having nominated themselves as potential lead registrants. Once you have done that, and eventually when you are then selected as a lead, you can then click the lead registrant declaration button here. So that's indeed becoming a lead or nominating yourself in lead as a lead is a fairly simple process. Click of a button in cases where a lead is not yet available or has not been selected. So once you have been selected, the view looks like this. So for this particular substance, you will see that this Reach Law has been selected. You can also see here at the on the side information about the SIEF and who is the lead registrant. But then in cases where there are other companies who are also wanting to become the lead, so for example, they first clicked, there were no leads before, and they clicked the nomination button as you saw in the previous screenshots, but then another company also wants to become a lead. Then you select, apply for this lead registrant position as a lead candidate, and then you will be included into the list of potential lead registrants or candidates thereof. And in this, you then, from a SIEF member perspective, you then conduct this voting. So here, for example, if I now wanted to vote on Istanbul Chemicals Corporation International, this is a fictional company, obviously, then you would tick the box, go to the next view, and issue your vote, and that would lock in your vote. And after that, you could open a list of other companies who voted for this particular company here. So you could see who has voted. So it is indeed, it's a very simple process in KKS to nominate yourself, and also from like a SIEF member perspective, pre-SIEF member perspective, to vote, cast your vote, and then see who else has voted for this particular lead registrant. And then eventually take the lead registrant position in the IT system once you have been voted as the lead registrant. But that's not enough. So this is not enough that you have gone through the hoops here in KKS. You also have to go provide information about the SIEF agreement and stuff, and I'll show you that in the next slide, not this one. So essentially, the approval process is fairly straightforward. You will need to give the pre-SIEF members 30 days to approve or reject the candidate. The legal text in this procedures and processes does state that also these pre-SIEF members who are casting their vote should then communicate their opinions and justifications by email. You cannot do this in KKS. You can just tick the boxes in KKS, but you should these members who are voting should then provide these justifications by email to the lead registrant candidate or candidates. And who wins? It is very clear that absolute majority of votes wins the lead registrant nomination in KKS. So if you have to have more than 50% of the votes. If there are no votes casted, then no votes are considered as a positive response. And this is applicable only in these no one casts any vote cases, but because otherwise that could skew all the voting and make it subject to some manipulation, if you will. But simple, not simple, but absolute majority vote determines who becomes the lead. If for whatever reason you don't get this absolute majority, then and there's no other one gets it, then you will have to do this election again. So indeed, it is not enough that you just get voted for in this in the KKS system and receiving these emails on saying why you are a good lead registrant and why any specific company as part of the pre-SIEF voted for you. You also have to carry out certain SIEF communication with these pre-SIEF members. And this communication will be foremostly encompass the SIEF agreement or the SIEF draft agreement as such, covering all the items that are needed, or just some sort of other detailed list of items that are going to be covered in the SIEF agreement and how those are covered in this agreement. The reason thereof why this is also part of the lead registration process is that the SIEF members, the pre-SIEF members, have to approve on this SIEF agreement or at least the items thereof. Again, these have to be accepted by 50% of those pre-SIEF members So again, this absolute majority vote applies. So because there is no voting button in KKS for this type of things, then it is the lead registrant who receives emails or receives no emails from anyone by applicable timeline given to provide feedback on the SIEF agreement, for example, like two weeks or 15 days or whatever you reasonably think is applicable in your case, then you will become the lead registrant. So what this means is that besides, just to reiterate, besides having the KKS nomination, the click of a button in the KKS system, you also have to get approval for the SIEF agreement. And also as part of this, you also provide information about tonnage bands and coverages thereof and how data sharing will be conducted. But typically this is information that is integrated in the SIEF agreement also. So if it integrates all of this and you get approval for this SIEF agreement, or let's put it this way, no one complains about it materially, then and only then you will actually become the lead registrant for this substance. And all of this has to happen by end of this year, because at this point in time, you have been selected as a lead when you have gone through these two steps, KKS nomination and this SIEF communication part that's discussed here in this slide. So indeed, once those have been ticked off, and only then are you the selected lead registrant, then you can start with the practical work. Again, if as part of the second step, absolute majority vote is not achieved for whatever reason, let's say you have 10 pre-SIEF members and half of them are complaining, they don't accept, then of course that is a bust. You will not achieve over 50% majority vote, and you will have to start the process again. So you can see that if there are issues in the voting process, or there are companies who don't want you to become a lead, then you need to reissue the election process, and someone else should, of course, optimally become the lead registrant, because you will essentially be voted out already by not receiving the needed support. So if you need to go through this process several times, you can quite quickly understand that time is very short for that, because all of this should happen by end of this year. So indeed, let's say you then finally, also the SIEF agreement has, or the topics covered in the SIEF agreement, so this basic data sharing, etc., tonnage bands information, coverages, etc., have been discussed and agreed upon. You are now selected as lead. You should also notify this to all the members, pre-SIEF members, by email, and then start the practical registration work. So then we have this slight outlier case of already nominated lead registrants. So in these cases, for substances that already have this lead registrant nominated by the publication dates of the 12th of August this year, but they have not yet submitted a lead dossier, then the selection may have to be redone if necessary. It says if necessary in this procedures and processes document under Article 8. What this if necessary can be, it could mean that if the selection process wasn't done properly to begin with, someone just grabbed the lead position and did not consult the pre-SIEF members in any way to get the majority, etc., then this could be contested, the lead status and voting, and all of these two-step process would need to be redone, and again by end of this year. So, but if you have submitted the lead dossier already, then you are the lead registrant. There is no voting is needed, or you don't have to go through this. So indeed, last week actually, there was a workshop, authority workshop. I thought I'd cover this just because out of interest. It's not specifically related to this lead registrant selection completely, but just wanted to highlight that indeed there was this workshop arranged by the ministry It was held in Turkey, in Ankara. It was on live event, in-person event, and Regional also attended this two-day event. Just a few general notes from the workshop here for me to share with you. So the authority are aiming to have the sort of an inventory of substance, Turkish inventory of substance, published by end of March, coinciding with this provisional registration deadline. Maybe they are linked, maybe not, but it should also contain an information about classification and labeling about the substance. So it would be online, apparently, and searchable, and you could see probably basic substance information and classification, labeling, etc. type of information, like you have, for example, you can see on the ECHA web pages under the classification, labeling, in inventory, or this general substance information portal. ECHA contains more information because those are substances that have been registered. But this remains to be seen what it exactly will contain, but it's good to see that they will publish something by end of March next year. Also, good to understand that this pre-registration window will remain open after this pre-registration deadline. So as discussed earlier, the inquiry functionality will not be there starting 2027, but it will be there starting 2031, so after the last registration deadline. So this calls into question, what if I have not pre-registered by this deadline? Well, then you are not compliant. So what does that mean? Well, in practice, I guess it would mean that you would pre-register as soon as possible, because you need to participate in a pre-save to be able to register. But indeed, this is 31st of October is a hard deadline, as in the legal text, so there could be some repercussions if you are not pre-registered by that deadline, even though you should have. So I invite everyone to just take this end of this month pre-registration deadline very seriously, and have your substances pre-registered by then you are clear to continue without potential repercussions. Also, a good and welcome functionality is that it will be possible to deactivate these not longer needed pre-registrations in KKS. And what was also mentioned was pertaining to this lead registrant selection process was that this TOB and also other associations like TKSD will take an active role in determining the lead registrants for substances where these leads are not yet available. So, but that said, they will not be forcing anyone to take a lead role, but they will be part of the process, suggesting who should maybe become a lead, and probably trying to convince those to become a lead, etc. So, and also there will be a template for these provisional lead and co-registrations in KKS, and that is why we suspect the KKS system is not allowing yet to these registrations to be submitted. So indeed, it will be just another template that you can select when preparing these provisional registrations in the KKS. We'll talk about this in the next part in more detail. It will also be possible to deactivate registration directly in KKS and not having to go through this slightly bureaucratic way of contacting the ministry manually, etc., to deactivate or remove substances, but you should now be able to do it directly in KKS. And what is also interesting is that from 2027, so after the first registration deadline, they have said that they will have introduced more stringent surveillance of compliance and introduce more stringent penalties for non-compliance. So what that means in practice, we'll see, but it coincides with the first registration deadline. So I would say that they will have some campaigns to check whether companies have registered substances that need to be registered by the first deadline, and if not, then suffer the consequences. So that was the workshop, but also the Turkish Chemical Manufacturers Association, so TKSD, will have a webinar next week on 16th of October. Well, they will also go into more details on this procedures and principles document, probably building upon the meeting in Ankara already. So we have given permission to also provide this registration link here. So for those of you who maybe want to join this webinar, I will ask my colleague when she sends out a thank you for joining this webinar. She will also include this registration link in that thank you, likely tomorrow, so you do not have to type it down or screenshot it at this point in time. You can, of course, if you want to get a head start. But I recommend you join this webinar also. Rich Rome will be there also to join this webinar. So we look forward to that next week. And thank you to TKSD for organizing that. All right, that was the selection procedure. Now a few slides on SIEF communication. This will be quick. And thank you for those of you who are still with us as we are going over the one, or we have already gone over the 1 hour timeline as hinted upon earlier. So good to know that when it comes to this SIEF communication, it is something that is not predicated just the registration part of the work. It will continue as long as a lead registrant is a lead registrant for a specific substance, and that substance is on the Turkish market. So just wanted to highlight that. But indeed, if we look at the SIEF communication requirements on the lead registrant, so the appointment of lead registrant, we looked at that already. So that involved certain steps pertaining to SIEF communication, either in through the KKS system, but mostly as emails. And you will, that may not have been entirely clear, but I'll mention it here. You can actually download the pre-SIEF members as an Excel file with their contact details as they have indicated in the KKS system when they signed up. So there will be these email addresses, which you can then use when you communicate via email. Then the SIEF agreement, we discussed that also in the previous slide. But eventually, of course, when you sign those and finalize those, that entails communication back and forth, likely to some degree. But if you agreed it already, principally by in the lead, as part of the lead registrant nomination part, then it should be rather smooth sailing, because you had your say as a co-registrant, potential co-registrant earlier to voice your opinion. Now, at this point in time, it should be more on some small nuances and finalizing something, not major topics. But then, of course, agree on the substance identity. This is something that we'll discuss in the next slide briefly. Also, need to communicate and ask about the registration intentions, who actually going to register, so that we can have a, for example, when determining potential letter of access costs, we can at least get a first indication of what those could be, because per company, because it depends on how many registrants there are, in what tonnage band they are registering, and if they are registering as a full substance or intermediate, etc. And of course, very important, check what data is available from within the pre-SIEF SIEF from the members, because this information will be used in the lead registrant dossier. In many cases, co-regs do not have or do not own this information, and thus the lead registrant negotiates access to this information from the data holders. We will talk about this as part of part 2 webinar. But if you do, then you should share this information, because you will not have to pay for that information as part of the letter of access again. So just be aware of that. Of course, scope of the registration, covered uses, so that there can be determining the CSR applicable and guidance of safe use, classification and labeling related information, will be the classification of the substance, well, and labeling, well, in 99.9 cases out of 100, of course, it will be the same as under EU REACH. There could be changes, but likely the same. And of course, they need to communicate information on this provisional registration. This is a new addition to all of this based on these procedures and processes document. We'll talk about this, as mentioned, more in the next part 2 webinar, so stay tuned for that. And then, of course, issuance of this letter of accesses, partial letter of accesses, any updates, etc. So a lot of communication is done by the lead registrant towards and with the members of the pre-SIEF and the SIEF and potential registrants and so forth. And of course, it is a good practice by the lead registrant to also keep all these companies up to date on where we are, where the lead registration process is going, the timelines, etc. So that encompasses the updates in the bullet number 10. So it's a continuous process as a lead throughout the registration process and beyond. So if there are updates to the dossier required later on, of course, that is something that needs to be issued. But we'll talk about that actually as part of webinar, the third part of this webinar series, the joint registration management. And the final bullet here, as part of the initiating the lead registration process, is determining the substance identity profile and agreeing upon that. So indeed, this is something that is initiated by the lead registrant, typically, of course, utilizing the same SIP substance identity profile that was used for EU REACH registration purposes for the same substance. However, there could be some small fine-tunings, but this is something that is communicated to the members and by the lead, and the lead then expects feedback from the members on this SIP, but of course hoping that it would not deviate significantly from the EU REACH one, because if it does, it could have repercussions on the scope of the actual registration. So meaning maybe some data more data would be needed. For example, if there were exposure-based waivings done, but in the Turkish version, you could not waive those exposures because there are additional uses or because something else or impurities profiles differing, then that could entail a lot more work as part of preparing the lead dossier. Anyway, SIP is pretty straightforward. I think many of you, especially those who have dealt with the EU REACH, registered as part of EU REACH, you have seen these substance identity profiles being shared by lead registrants or consortia. But indeed, rest of the lead registrant process will be covered in this part 2 of 3. So this data access, dossier development, provisional registration, and submission webinar to be announced soon. So stay tuned for that. So quick action plan before going to conclusions and the Q&A. I'll go through this quickly. So indeed, you need to first determine, do you have the resources and abilities to take care of the lead registration work as a whole? If not, you can get help, of course, early in the process. We're not early in the process. It's quite dire at the moment or urgent. But if you need help, then please solicit. And of course, REACH is happy to help. Then nominate yourself in this KKS system as a candidate, and then you send out these emails to all the pre-SIEF members with justification why you should be a good lead registrant. Do that now as soon as possible, because there are certain delays. There's the 30 days in KKS, and then beyond that also a couple of weeks delay when you have people commenting the SIEF agreement, for example. So you remember the two-step process. So you need to have everyone the pre-registrant pre-SIEF members, then allow them time to voice their opinion as mentioned, and then remember that this absolute majority is what rules. So if you get more than 50% of the votes or support for your case, then you are the lead registrant. You have been selected, and all of this should happen before end of this year. So once you've chosen as the lead, again, notify by email to all pre-SIEF members that you are indeed now the lead. Select the lead and how you plan on going forward with that. So indeed, jumped a bit ahead of myself here, but indeed this SIEF agreement communication is very important, and it's part of the lead selection process. So again, you need to allow members to accept and reject this, for example, during 2 weeks. And once those have been accepted for 50%, majority accepts, meaning over 50%, then the actual lead registration work can start with the SIP and other communication. But just be aware that just the lead registrant selection process it can be quite, the workload can be quite high from an admin perspective. So please keep that in mind and just start as soon as possible. Document everything. Record keeping is very important. That is something we have seen and can attest to. So document, rather over document than under document. Easier later on to revert back to some information if you have it versus you don't have it for obvious reasons. So really, the reality check at the moment is that time to act is now. If you want to register a substance, it must have a lead registrant. Otherwise, it will not be registered. So if there is no lead registrant and you want to register, and you, for example, want to continue placing this substance on the Turkish market, then you should become the lead registrant. Because if you think you should be the lead, and you have a vested interest, then do so. There's no time to wait. And just note that actually doing the lead registration work is not, it sounds and maybe looks quite tedious and overwhelming, but it is not, because the biggest puzzle is already, piece of the puzzle is already there, and that is the availability of data from EU Reach, which we can use for KKDIK purposes. So don't be afraid of becoming the lead. Just get a good consultant like ReachLaw to help you with the lead dossier. If you can't do it yourself, we're happy to help. We can do it, no problem. And if you work through, for example, ReachLaw as an only representative, then we will take care of this. Just give it, we need your go-ahead to do this. So act now to become the lead. Otherwise, there's a risk that there will be no lead, and even though TOB and the authorities will then try to find the lead, someone still has to become the lead, and rather hate becoming the lead the least, and just take up the lead role and get it done with. You will get compensated for your work when you have your when the co-registrants are buying letter of accesses for this provisional registration, the partial, and then finally for the full registration. We'll talk about that more in part of part 3 as mentioned. Conclusions really quickly. So indeed, this procedures and principles that was published in August, it is law and it's already entered in force. It defines this lead registration selection process and defined a deadline for it, which is end of this year, for applicable for most substances. You need to have a lead registrant to be able to register a substance. So just pick up the role and be done with it. And for example, solicit help through ReachLaw, for example, or any other good lead registrant consultant who has experience in the lead registration process from EU, for example, and Turkey, and why not UK also. Usually those know what it means and they can get the job done. I now hash through this lead registration selection process so many times that I will just jump through it here. So put simply, notify yourself as a lead for substances that do not have a lead registrant yet, and do this now ASAP, because it has to be done and completed by end of this year. And as said, we're happy to help. Ask for quotation. You can contact me directly or through sales@reachlaw.fi. You can contact, of course, Sibel also directly. Any which way will work. We're happy to help. For Q&As, I suspect I will have to probably jump through some of the questions because in the interest of time, I see that there are questions coming in. Let me have a quick look at those. Yes, I'll come back to those. So indeed, we had quite a few questions submitted when submitted in advance as part of the registration to this webinar. So I'll go through these quite quickly. And Sibel, if you are ready, then I will ask you to answer some of these questions, but I'll try to go through this quite quickly.
Yes,
so, thank you. First question, in case another company is willing to be a lead registrant, but for lower tonnage band than we desire, what happens? So I can take this, Sibel. I mean, the point is that if someone becomes a lead, of course, they have to cover in the joint registration part. So for the endpoint data, they have to cover the highest tonnage band. But the lead itself can register for a lower tonnage band. But the joint submission part has to cover the highest tonnage band. So in essence, it is okay but they just have to cover your higher tonnage band also. This is, for example, we saw this in many cases in the EU. Ideally, of course, the lead registrant has the highest tonnage band, then it's very clear. But it is possible to also have a low lead registrant itself for its company registers a lower tonnage band, but covers a higher tonnage band in the joint submission in the lead registration dossier. Next question, timeline for lead registration work scheduled for finish by end of 2026. So stay tuned for part 2 of this webinar. I'll just, that's a quick answer. As fragrance manufacturers, can we ask our raw material manufacturers if their registration can cover our indirect Turkey imports? So yes, you can, provided your raw material manufacturers have appointed an only representative for KKDIK purposes and accepts to cover indirect imports. For example, Reachlaw in most cases accepts this, and it depends on our clients, of course, but I would say most would accept it, but they need to know, otherwise you're not covered. Please discuss the definite timelines as to when registration is mandatory and pre-registration is no longer sufficient. Well, we talked about this. So pre-registration deadline is end of this month, and the actual registration deadlines are then as shown in the presentation earlier, but we also have these provisional registration deadlines, which we discussed also. So I think that has been adequately covered in the presentation. Is there a chance that authorities would change the model to recognize EU REACH registration? Sibel, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Just to say that this has been already discussed, and then it has been more than 1 year. These discussions ongoing, but now there is no option for this. No other models to be implemented.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Sibel. And we also covered this question 6, what happens with those lead registrants that were already elected back in 2024. So it depends if they submitted a dossier, then that's done and dusted more or less. But if they did not submit the dossier, and if there are some issues with the selection process back then it could be that they will have to go through the selection process again. It said if necessary. You be the judge of what is if necessary at the end of the day. How will the lead authorities select the lead registrant? On what basis? What data do they have about companies? we discussed this in quite great detail, but maybe Sibel, if you want to elaborate on what data do they have about the companies. I mean, to my understanding, this is what has been submitted in as part of the pre-registration, but maybe if you want to, if you need to elaborate, please do so.
Yes, Fede, just to say that the in KKS, when you are submitting the pre-registration, you are providing the ID of substance and then the tonnage band for the substance. And then it's also required that the company provide the information on company basis. Then the authority is having understanding on what the company is, and then the size of the company, and also the tonnage band. This information are available to the authority.
Indeed. And of course, they can check what this company is online and so forth to do a bit of investigation. But they have quite a lot of like identifying information already as part of the pre-registration. And next question, would it be necessary to pay the law to submit the provisional co-registration? So indeed, this is what we call the partial law. So I invite you to stay tuned for part 2 because we will be covering this there. But the short answer is yes, because you will be referring to certain FISCEM data that needs to be submitted as part of a provisional lead registration. And that data could be subject to costs, and to be able to share those costs, you would have to then buy partial Electrovax. But we'll discuss this in more detail in part 2. Is there an option to refuse the government appointment as a lead registrant? Will the ministry support companies forced to be lead registrant with data? So as mentioned, no one will force you to become a lead. Sibel, do you want to elaborate on this if you want to?
Yes, then just to say that the authority will encourage them to, with available information, then to initiate maybe the discussion, but not to force, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. And this was slightly unclear before, but now based on workshop last week, this was specifically asked. So this is good news. No one will force a lead registrant position upon you. But this again just emphasizes that you should just go ahead and step up, become the lead to get this over with, because there will be no fallback. No one will be forced to become the lead. So again, back to square one in a sense. Next question goes to you, Sibel. So what can co-registrants do if the lead registrant has not submitted the provisional registration by end of March 26? And assuming they needed to submit it. So what should co-regs do?
Yes, then as you already informed in your slides in the webinar, during the webinar, just to proceed with the registration, first we need to have the lead registrant for that substance. Then co-registrant can submit its member registration dossier. It's required to have the lead registrant.
Yeah, and let's say if the lead, if for whatever reason misses this deadline, then I would just recommend communicating with the ministry on this and see what type of a solution they have for this.
Yes.
So what are the differences between provisional registration and final registration deadlines and etc.? We'll talk about this in the next webinar, so stay tuned. Or you can have a look at the previous webinar we had a month ago. But next webinar, part 2, will go into more details. Then a bit of an offshoot here. Can the non-Turkish manufacturer formulator who has appointed an OR in Turkey issue OR certificates to their customers on behalf of their Turkish OR? So no, it's the OR who issues certificates. So of course the OR could give a certificate to the manufacturer that the manufacturer then provides to the customers. That's fine, but the issuer of certificates is the OR. Then what criteria will be used for selection of lead for substances without the lead? This we discussed already. I would say argue that the most important part is does the company have the experience and know how to be able to take care of the lead registration work? If you become the lead, will you need to submit the lead dossier even if your tonnage means a deadline potentially late 2030. So yes, so this is what I mentioned earlier. So if you are a lead, you could have a case where you are covering, you don't need to register a higher tonnage band, for example, have a deadline by end of next year. But as you are the lead registrant, you are submitting the joint submission information on behalf of everyone else who is intending to register, becoming a member of the joint submission. So you have to submit first, even though you could have yourself a lower tonnage band, which in of itself could indicate that your specific registration deadline would be, if you were a member registrant, the co-registrant would be, for example, 2030. But as you are lead, you will have to submit first. When does the ministry plan to appoint a lead registrant in case no company volunteers to become the? So this we covered already. So they will not appoint anyone. They would just encourage companies. And I mean, I suspect, and Sibel, you can elaborate on this, but I suspect they will see early next year what substances do not have a lead, and that will kick into force this trying to convince companies to become a lead. So there probably will be spillover. I don't personally think that it will happen in December. I suspect it would start in January. Well, what do you think, Sibel?
Just to say, it has been also discussed in the workshop to say that authorities just responded saying that it do not have a timeline, but saying that within the process also, then first communicate between the SIEF. If you see that there is an issue with selecting the leads, then they will be always there to support, to encourage, and provide the information on the selection process.
Yeah. Thank you, Sibel. And the last few questions here, and then I'll pick up a few in the Q&A, and then we have to conclude. Sorry for going over time more than expected. So, will the lead registrant be selected for all substances? Well, only those substances that you want to register. So, I want to keep on the Turkish market after the registration deadline. So, I expect that, of course, all substances will not have a lead, but there is expecting that there will be around 15,000 different substances being subject to KKDIK registration, which means that they should have, these 15,000 substances should have a lead registrant to be determined. But of course, if you suspect that your substance will not get a lead and you want to continue placing the substance on the market after the registration deadline and after actually the provisional registration deadline for leads, which is end of March next year, then you should become the lead registrant. So that's again, we'll come back to the same question and same recommendation. Just take up the lead registration role and just be done with it, and just be mindful that you will get compensated for the work and the costs, because that's in the law. Sharing costs and data, that's obligatory. And then is it an obligation to introduce the importer's data in the KKDIK dossier? So Annex 1 of the procedures and principles. Not exactly sure what this means, but lead registrants have certain information that needs to be included in the provisional registration dossier, and then co-registrants have lesser company-specific information that needs to be included in the dossier. How do you, Sibel, did you understand this question? Maybe it's from an OR perspective. The OR was need. Yeah, go ahead, Sibel.
Yes, I understand that here is mentioned about the importer's edition. Then, according to this, yes, authority needs to have this importer's information, meaning who is the importer. Then, from the OR perspective, to include the importers, to have visibility on the supply chain.
Yeah.
Yes, then to respond.
Very good. Thank you, Sibel. And last question, pre-submitted. How will the deadline of choosing the lead registrant apply when the deadline of registration is 2030 because of low tonnage band? you still have to go through the selection process by end of this year with the deadline. So it doesn't matter if you have your actual registration deadline 2030 or 28, you still have to do it now by end of this year, unless you've already done it and you, for example, submitted your dossier, or you haven't submitted but no one is contesting your lead registration role. So that is very clear. Okay, so let's pick a few questions from the chat. Sorry for going over time again. Famous last words. Let's see. Give me a second to pull up the questions here. There's a lot of questions. Question, do we share the slides? No, we will not, but you will be able to watch the recording on YouTube. So you will find it there. I'll see. This question was answered in other words already on the different volumes. Do I need to register a pre-registered substance that is now imported at less than 1 ton per year? So no, the threshold is 1 ton per year, so you do not have to do that. Just be mindful that if, for example, the volume would be incrementally increasing, then you could consider pre-registering, but from a legal perspective, you would not. Will the pre-registration be completely closed after end of this month, so the 31st of October, or will there still be a possibility of late pre-registration? So yes, late pre-registration will be possible for first time, according to the legal text now. Let's take a step back, and Sibel, you can elaborate on this, but pre-registration functionality will continue. That will not change despite the deadline end of this month for pre-registration. Technically, from a legal perspective, you had this, if you would now, after this deadline, for the first time place a substance on the Turkish market at 1 ton or more, then you would have 30 days time to do this late pre-registration. But if you now already are placing, as mentioned during the slides, if you now already are placing, let's say, a substance at more than 1 ton on the Turkish market, and you just forget or don't care about doing a pre-registration, you can still do a pre-registration. And I recommend, if you, for example, forget, then just do it as quickly as possible. There might be repercussions, but there will be no mechanism for stopping you doing a pre-registration. That is my understanding. Sibel, am I correct?
Yes, you are correct, Freddy.
Thank you. Very good. Okay, let's see. One final juicy question. Let's see. Okay, I'll take. There were questions about this provisional registration and the full and final. So stay tuned for part 2. We'll go through that in great detail. So last question, Sibel, this one goes to you. Any information when KKS would be open for dossier submissions? I covered it, but please, let's take it from you. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for this question. Then the authority is aiming to open the submission as soon as possible. Then I'm expecting that within this month, soonest it will be open for the submission. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Sibel. And a final question per se, but it comes here actually. Yeah, there are questions about the 2 other webinars, date and times, European time. So stay tuned. We have not decided on the specific dates yet, but we will communicate that very soon. So stay tuned. As I said, reach out to Reach Law for support with these lead registration processes, KKDIK, OR support, anything, we're happy to help. And here you see, we will send out the invitations for the upcoming parts 2 and 3 of this webinar series very shortly in the coming weeks. But with this concludes this webinar today. So that ticks off that box. So thank you very much for attending. And thank you, Sibel, very much for your support with this webinar. Of course, thank you to my colleagues also at Reachflow for organizing everything. And of course, the biggest thank you to all of you participating and listening, and a special thanks for those who are still listening at this overtime. So thank you a bunch. I wish you a very great day, and stay tuned for part 2 and 3 of this webinar series. Bye-bye.